porch light at my in-laws' house was always on when I pulled up. Every single time, for 6 years of marriage, that yellow light was burning when I turned into their driveway. My mother-in-law used to say it meant the family was home, that no one was ever really left outside. I believed her. I was 27 and newly married, and I believed everything she said with her hands folded and her voice like warm syrup. I don't believe her anymore. My husband's Callum died on a Tuesday in March. Black eyes on Route 9, the officer said. He was 31. We had been married 4 years by then, and I was 29, and I had no idea what came next. The weeks after the funeral are a blur. I don't try to reconstruct. People brought casseroles. My sister flew in from Portland. I sat in the house Callum and I had rented together, and I couldn't remember which bills I had paid and which ones I hadn't, because he had handled most of that. Not because I couldn't. I have a degree in accounting. I know how money works. But because we had divided things the way couples do, and the bills had been his side of the division. The apartment lease was up at the end of May, 2 months away. My job at the time was part-time bookkeeping for a dental office, 3 days a week, which had been enough when Callum's salary was in the picture. Without it, I was short. Not destitute, but short. I had about $9,000 in my personal savings account. My account, only my name, which turned out to matter more than I knew at the time. And no idea how far that would stretch in northern New Jersey, with a one-bedroom apartment going for $1,800 a month. My mother-in-law called me on a Wednesday evening, about 6 weeks after the funeral. She said she and my father-in-law had been talking. She said they were worried about me. She said family takes care of family, and that is what Callum would have wanted, and they had plenty of space since his brother had moved to Austin the year before, and why didn't I come stay with them in Millbrook while I figured things out? I said I didn't want to impose. She said, nonsense, you're not an outsider, you're ours. I said, let me think about it. She said, of course, take all the time you need, but the offer stands and we mean it. I thought about it for 4 days. I made a list the way I make lists when I'm scared, because the act of writing things down makes them feel more manageable. On one side, the cost of staying in the apartment, the uncertainty of finding a new place fast, the loneliness of being in a space that still smelled like him. On the other side, free room and board, time to save money, family around me. I moved to Millbrook on the first Saturday in June. My mother-in-law met me at the door with a hug that lasted longer than I expected. My father-in-law helped carry boxes from my car without saying much, which is how he has always shown affection. Their house is a colonial on a cul-de-sac, 4 bedrooms, a finished basement, a yard with a gas grill they use from May through October. The guest room was the one Callum had grown up in. She had cleared out most of his old things years ago, but there was still a shelf of trophies from his high school baseball years along one wall. I put my boxes in the corner and sat on the edge of the bed and told myself this was temporary. 3 months, maybe 4. Enough time to find a better paying position and figure out the longer-term plan. That first week was fine. She cooked. He watched the news. I helped with dishes and tried to stay out of the way and cried quietly at night with the pillow over my face so no one could hear. The second week, she mentioned that it would be nice if I could help with the grocery shopping since she was still recovering from her knee procedure. I said of course. She handed me the list and $100 in cash. The total came to $142. I paid the difference without saying anything. The third week she mentioned the yard service had gotten expensive and maybe I could take over mowing since I had more free time than they did. I said sure. The fourth week she mentioned that their cleaning lady had quit and things were getting a little behind and she knew I was good at organizing. I said I'd take care of it. I told myself this was fair. Room and board in exchange for some help around the house, that's a reasonable arrangement. I wrote it off as contributing, as being a good guest, as not wanting to be the kind of person who takes without giving back. I did not write any of it down. That was my mistake. By August, I had a full-time position. A small manufacturing company in Parsippany needed an in-house bookkeeper and the salary was decent. $54,000, which was more than I had made before. I gave my mother-in-law $300 a month toward household expenses, which she accepted with a smile and a comment about how it wasn't necessary, but she appreciated the gesture. I thought we had an understanding. What I didn't understand was that the understanding was entirely in my head. My father-in-law's car needed a new transmission in September. My mother-in-law mentioned it at dinner on a Thursday. Just mentioned it, the way you'd mention that the weather had turned cold, and looked at me across the table with her eyebrows raised just slightly. I said I was sorry to hear that. What was the estimate? She said the mechanic had quoted $2,200. I said that was a lot. She said yes, it really was, especially on a fixed income. I wrote them a check for $1,000 the next morning. I told myself it was the right thing to do. They had taken me in. They were Callum's parents. They were grieving too, and they had less flexibility than I did. I still believed all of those things. But I noticed for the first time that no one said thank you. My father-in-law nodded. My mother-in-law folded the check and put it in her cardigan pocket and said that was very kind. That was all. I went to work and did not think about it again until October, when the heating oil delivery came and she mentioned offhandedly that prices had really gone up this year. I want to be honest about something. I was not paying close enough attention. I was grieving and I was grateful and I was conflict avoidant in the way that people who grow up in quiet households sometimes are, where disagreement feels dangerous even when it isn't. I was also telling myself a story about what was happening that was easier to live inside of than the truth. The story I was telling myself, I was family, and family helps each other, and all of this was temporary and mutual, and came from a place of love. The truth I wasn't looking at, I was being managed. I don't say that with bitterness anymore. I've had time to sit with it, and what I feel now is mostly just clarity. The kind that comes after you've stopped being angry and started being honest with yourself about the part you played. I played the part of someone who needed to be needed, and they played the part of people who had learned, over a long marriage, how to make their needs sound like invitations. The thing that woke me up was small. Most waking up moments are. It was a Sunday in November. I was at the kitchen table with my laptop, doing some personal budget work, tracking expenses, which I had started doing more carefully since the transmission check. And my mother-in-law sat down across from me with her coffee and asked, very casually, whether I had ever looked into what Callum's life insurance situation was. I looked up from my screen. I said I thought we had covered all of that earlier in the year with the estate. She said yes, of course, but she meant specifically the policy through his employer. Had I received anything from that? I said I had. It had been a small policy, $12,000, and it had come to me as his named beneficiary. She nodded slowly. She said she only asked because she and my father-in-law had been doing some financial planning and they had come across some paperwork from years ago, before Callum changed his beneficiary when we got married, and they just wanted to make sure everything had been handled properly. I said it had been handled properly. She said that was good. She said she just wondered because there was also a separate policy, a private one, Callum had taken out before we met. And she wasn't sure I knew about it. I kept my face very still. I said I wasn't aware of a separate private policy. She said, oh, it might be nothing. She might be misremembering. Don't worry about it. She took her coffee and went back to the living room. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time without moving. I want to be clear about what I did next, because I think it matters. I did not confront her. I did not ask my father-in-law. I did not say a word to anyone in that house about what I was going to do. I went to work on Monday, and on my lunch break I called Callum's former employer's HR department and asked about the life insurance policy. They confirmed what I already knew. $12,000 paid out in April, case closed. Then I called a probate attorney in Morris County whose name I found through the State Bar Referral Service. Not a friend of the family, not anyone who had ever met Callum or his parents. A stranger, which was exactly what I needed. I described the situation. She asked me several questions. One of them was whether Callum had ever mentioned the permanent life insurance policy, the kind that builds cash value, as opposed to the term policy through his employer. I said I didn't know. She said those policies go through probate differently. She said if a policy exists and the beneficiary designation was never updated after marriage, depending on how the policy was written, there could be a legitimate question about who had the legal right to claim it. She also said, and this is the part I wrote down, word for word, that it would be worth requesting Callum's full financial records through the estate process, including any insurance policy documents, before making any assumptions in either direction. I thanked her and paid a consultation fee, which was $200, and I drove back to work and finished the afternoon like nothing had happened. The records took 3 weeks to arrive. I had a post office box by then. I had opened it the week after my conversation with the attorney, quietly, without mentioning it to anyone. I drove to the post office before work on a Tuesday and stood at a little metal door and took out a thick envelope and sat in my car in the parking lot with the heat running. There was a life insurance policy, private, whole life, taken out when Callum was 24. The face value was $80,000. The name beneficiary had never been changed. It listed his parents. I sat with that for a long time, long enough that I was 7 minutes late clocking in and had to tell my supervisor I'd had car trouble. I want to say I was shocked, but I think the more honest word is confirmed. Some part of me had already moved the pieces around in my head and arrived at approximately this picture. What I hadn't let myself do was look at it directly. I looked at it now. $80,000. An old policy. Parents as beneficiaries from before we met. And a mother-in-law who had brought it up on a Sunday morning, casual as weather, to see what I knew. Here is what I did not do. I did not accuse anyone of anything. Here is why. Because legally, depending on how the policy was written and when, they might have had a legitimate claim. Policies taken out before a marriage with original beneficiaries named can be complicated. My attorney was clear about that. It was not necessarily theft. It might have simply been paperwork. Callum never got around to updating. But here is what I knew for certain. They knew. They had known since at least the spring when the estate was being sorted. And they had said nothing to me. They had let me move into their house and buy their groceries and write checks for their car repairs and clean their bathrooms, and they had said nothing. That was the thing I couldn't get past. Not the money, exactly. The silence. I thought about Callum. I thought about whether he would have wanted them to have it. I thought about what he would have said if he had known we were all sitting in the same house with this between us. I thought about it for 2 weeks and then I stopped thinking about it and started doing. I found an apartment in Montclair. Studio 900 square feet, $1,400 a month. I signed the lease in December, gave myself a January 1st move-in date, and said nothing to my in-laws until December 26th, the day after Christmas dinner. When we were all sitting around in that particular post-holiday quiet that feels both full and empty at the same time, I said I had something to tell them. My mother-in-law set down her coffee. I said I had found my own place and I would be moving out on January 1st. My father-in-law looked at his wife. She looked at me. She said this was very sudden. I said I had been thinking about it for a while. She said she hoped I hadn't felt rushed or unwelcome. I said no, everyone had been very kind, and I needed to take the next step. My father-in-law said he was glad I was getting back on my feet. He said Callum would have been proud. I nodded and said I thought so too, and I excused myself to go pack. I did not mention the policy. I had made a decision not to mention it, not then, not in that house, not with the Christmas tree still lit in the corner. There are fights worth having, and there are disclosures that serve nothing but your own anger. And I had spent 6 weeks figuring out the difference. I moved on January 2nd, because January 1st I spent at my sister's house in Portland, watching movies and eating takeout, and telling her the whole story while she sat with her mouth progressively more open. She said I should hire a lawyer and fight for it. I said I had talked to a lawyer. She said, and? I said, and it's complicated, legally. Whole life policies with named beneficiaries are generally paid directly to those beneficiaries outside of probate, unless there's evidence of specific intent to change the designation. Callum had never formally changed it. It was probably going to them regardless. She said that was deeply unfair. I said yes. And also it was probably not illegal. She said there was a lot of space between unfair and illegal. I said I knew. I was learning to live in that space. She looked at me for a long moment and then she handed me more of the lo mein and didn't push it further. That is one of the things I love most about her. The studio in Montclair was on the 3rd floor of a building that had been renovated sometime in the 90s and not much since. The radiator knocked. The bathroom tile was a shade of beige that had not been fashionable in 30 years. The windows looked out over a parking lot. I loved it. I loved it in the way you love something that is entirely yours, with no one else's fingerprints on it. I painted one wall a dark sage green, which my mother would have called a mistake and which I thought was perfect. I bought a second-hand couch and a coffee table from the Facebook Marketplace and a set of dishes that didn't match because I found them at 2 different estate sales and they made me happy. I set up my desk in the corner by the window and I opened my laptop and I started looking at my finances the way I hadn't since before Callum died. Really looking. Not just checking balances, but mapping things out, building a full picture. I had about $14,000 saved, which was more than I had expected because I had not, in the end, spent as much as I thought on my in-laws. The checks I had written, the groceries, the heating oil, I added it up. Roughly $6,000 over 7 months. Not a small amount, not a devastating one either. I set up a proper budget, a real one. I built it in a spreadsheet because I know my way around a spreadsheet, and I gave every dollar a job, the way the financial books say to do. And I started making decisions with my eyes open instead of my guilt switched on. It felt like waking up. My mother-in-law called in February. She said she just wanted to check in and see how I was settling into the new place. I said I was settling in well, thank you. She said she and my father-in-law had been thinking about me a lot. I said I appreciated that. She said there was something she had been meaning to bring up, something she probably should have mentioned sooner. And she hoped I would understand that they had only been trying to protect me from additional stress during a very hard time. I sat down on my sage green wall side of the couch and waited. She said there was an old insurance policy of Callum's. She said they had received the payout from it. She said she wanted me to know that they hadn't intended to keep it without telling me. They had just been waiting for the right moment, and they wanted to share it with me, give me a portion, because family is family and it wouldn't feel right otherwise. I was quiet for a moment. I said I appreciated her telling me. She said of course they would never want me to feel left out or deceived. She hoped I knew that. I said I did know that. She asked if I would come for dinner soon so we could talk in person. I said maybe in a few weeks. Things were busy at work. She said of course no rush, just let her know. I said I would. I hung up and I sat in my apartment with a knocking radiator and a parking lot view and I thought about the word portion. Not half. Not your rightful share. Portion. I picked up my phone and called my sister and told her. My sister said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I already did it." 3 months earlier, when I was still in the Millbrook house and doing my research and seeing my attorney, I had also done one other thing. I had quietly opened a Roth IRA and started contributing the maximum. I had set up automatic transfers from my checking account so that the money moved before I could second guess it. I had increased my contribution to my employer's 401k to 8%. I had started a separate high-yield savings account at a credit union with no connection to any account Callum and I had shared, and I had been putting $500 a month into it. These are not dramatic things. They are spreadsheet things. They are the things you do when you stop waiting to be rescued and start being the person who handles it. I did not tell my mother-in-law any of this. I did not tell her that when she called in February with her offer of a portion. I had already done the math, and I knew that the money, while meaningful, was not what determined my future. What determined my future was what I did from January onward, month by month, decision by decision. I told my sister I already did it. What I meant was I already stopped needing it to be different than it was. My mother-in-law sent a check in March. It was for $10,000. The total payout had been $80,000. I held the check for a long time. I thought about what it would feel like to send it back. I thought about what it would feel like to cash it and say nothing. I thought about what Callum would have said, and I realized I had stopped being able to predict that as clearly as I used to, which maybe meant I was finally thinking for myself again, instead of through the filter of who he was to me. I deposited it. I did not send a thank you note. I did not go to dinner in Moolbrook that spring or the spring after. My father-in-law sent me a card on the anniversary of Callum's death both years. Just his handwriting and a short line about remembering him. I sent a card back both times. That feels like the right amount of contact for now. My studio in Montclair is not my endpoint. I know that the same way I know a lot of things now that I didn't know at 29, with the particular steadiness that comes not from certainty but from having made enough decisions that you trust yourself to make the next one. I have been promoted once. I am studying for the CPA exam, which I have been meaning to do for years and kept not doing because there was always something else. Some reason to wait. And I have stopped waiting for reasons to stop waiting. I refinance my student loans at a lower rate. I understand my credit score and what moves it. I keep an emergency fund that covers 4 months of expenses, not because something is certain to go wrong, but because the alternative is making decisions from fear instead of from thought. And I have done enough of the fear-based kind to know the difference. I have a friend named Audra, who I met at a CPA study group at the library and who is the funniest person I have encountered since Callum, in a completely different way. We get dinner most Wednesdays. I have learned to let a friendship be simple, without needing it to be something that saves me. I still miss him. That has not gotten smaller. It has gotten more shapeable maybe. More something I can carry without losing my footing. But it has not gotten smaller and I would not want it to, because the size of the grief is the size of what was real, and what was real was real. What I want to say, and what I keep finding it hard to say simply because it still costs me something to admit, is that those 7 months in Millbrook were not just something that happened to me. They were something I let happen. Not the grief. The grief wasn't a choice. Not the original decision to move in. That was reasonable, maybe even wise, but every time I wrote a check and said nothing, every time I cleaned the bathroom and called it contributing, every time I told myself this was fair, and then didn't look closely enough at whether it was, that was me, my choices, my avoidance. I'm not saying I deserved what happened, I'm saying I participated in the conditions that made it possible. I think about the women who will read this and recognize themselves in it, who are somewhere inside that same arrangement, living in someone else's house, absorbing someone else's needs, telling themselves it's temporary, telling themselves they're being good, feeling the slow press of their own agency narrowing. I want to say something useful to those women. Here is what I would say: open your own account at a bank no one else uses and put something in it this week. Not because money is everything. Because the act of doing it is the act of saying, I exist separately from this situation. I have a future that is mine to build. I am not waiting to be allowed, that's all. That one thing. The rest comes from doing it again the next week. There is a window in my apartment that faces east. In winter, the sun hits it at about 7 in the morning, and if I am up early enough, I can sit on the couch with coffee and watch the light change against the parking lot in a way that is not beautiful exactly, but is mine. Wholly and uncomplicatedly mine. In a way that the guest room with the baseball trophies never was. I sit there most mornings now. I don't think about Millbrook very much. When I do, it doesn't feel like a wound anymore. It feels more like a case study, something I can look at clearly and learn from, and even occasionally be almost grateful for. because it taught me things about myself that comfort would not have. I know where my money is. I know what I spend and what I save and what I owe and what I own. I know my own name on my own accounts, and I know what that means in the specific legal non-negotiable sense that matters when the things you thought were permanent turn out not to be. I know how to sit in a room that belongs to me and feel the difference. That is not a small thing. That is, I think, the whole thing. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since all of this happened. Not in a dramatic way, just quietly, the way you do when you're sitting alone in an apartment that finally feels like yours and you have enough distance to see the shape of things. What my in-laws did had consequences, not because the universe was keeping score, but because actions between people leave marks, and those marks accumulate into outcomes. They chose silence over honesty for months. They let me clean their house and write checks for their car while they sat on information that affected my life directly. That choice, repeated, deliberate, is what ended the relationship, not my anger, not the money itself. The choosing over and over again not to tell me. I think about that when I'm tempted to be careless with people I care about. The small dishonesties feel manageable in the moment. They feel protective even, but they compound. And what compounds eventually settles, and what settles either holds you up or gives way under you. My mother-in-law is not a villain. I want to be clear about that because I think it matters morally to be precise. She is a woman who was afraid of loss, of financial instability, of a future without her son in it, and she made choices from that fear that she probably told herself were reasonable. That is a very human thing to do. I have done versions of it myself. The difference is only in the scale and in who it cost. What I had to build after Millbrook was not just financial stability. It was the habit of acting from thought instead of from fear or from guilt. Every time I transferred money into my savings account in those early months, I was practicing a kind of integrity. Not a showy kind, not one anyone could see, but the kind that matters most, which is the kind you practice when no one is watching and nothing is forcing you. Callum used to say that the measure of a person is what they do with the hand they didn't ask for. I think about that more now than I did when he was alive. Grief was a hand I didn't ask for. The situation in Millbrook was a hand I didn't ask for. What I did with both of them, slowly, imperfectly, in increments small enough that no single one felt significant, that was mine. Alder asked me once over dinner on one of our Wednesdays whether I thought any of it had made me harder. I thought about it seriously before I answered. I said I didn't think so. I said I thought it had made me more accurate. About people, about money, about what I actually need versus what I've been taught to feel guilty for not giving. There's a difference between hard and clear. Hard closes things off. Clear just lets you see them as they are. I see my life clearly now. That took longer than I expected and cost more than I planned. But I'm not sure there's another way to get there. Not for me anyway. Not for someone who had to learn, at 29, in the cold January of the worst year of her life, that the only account she could entirely trust was the one with only her name on it. That's not cynicism. That's just the truth held without bitterness, the way you hold anything you've earned the right to know.